Ya da da ya da da ya da 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 ya da ya da ya da da ya da da ya da 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 ya da ya da ya da da ya da da ya da da ya da ya da ya da ya da da ya da da ya da da ya da ya da ya da. Boker Tov, everybody. It is so fantastic to see so many of you here this morning as we come together for what I have no doubt will be a really important and interesting program. So I'm glad that many of you have found seats. If you have not yet grabbed coffee or food, there is plenty of both. So please do so now, or feel free to get up even throughout the program and to be able to fill your bellies as you also fill your minds. So I'm Rabbi Roni, for those of you who I might not know. I know we have a lot of guests to BTBJ this morning, and we're thrilled that you're all here with us, as well as our members. And this year at BTBJ, we have a theme for the year, which doesn't dictate all of our programming, but certainly inspires a lot of it. And the theme that we introduced at Rosh Hashanah is Lev Shomea. It is a listening heart, which means that when we enter into conversation with one another, when we have different opportunities presented to us, that we enter into that with an open, listening, curious heart, willing heart to be a part of that conversation and to enter into relationship with the storyteller, because stories are so important to really kind of trying to capture who we are and how it is that we came to be here in any given moment. Each one of us has such a unique story to tell, both from our own lived experience and from the generations that came before us that made it possible for us to be the ones standing here today. And so this year we've been really focused on hearing the stories from each of us, from one another, as a way to deepen the sense of community within the BTBJ community. And so that requires two things. On the one hand, it requires a willing person to share their story. And as I said in the beginning, it also requires that each of us enter into that moment of listening, that moment of receiving that story with a Lev Shomea, with an open, discerning, listening, curious heart. So as we were having conversations in our Congregational Learning Committee this year about some of the stories that we'd like to raise up throughout the year, Bryan is a member of our committee, and we've talked before about Jeff's family story, and we agreed that this would be a fantastic addition to our year, and Jeff was a willing participant to be able to share this story with all of you. And Jeff is no stranger to our community, but this particular piece, like all of this information that you're going to hear today, isn't something that he shares every day. And so it's a real gift and treat for all of us to get to be here and to not just hear some interesting story of someone out in the world, but to really also be able to understand the way in which this story has affected our own members. So it is a real treat for us, and I'm in advance. I'm expressing my appreciation for your willingness to be here. And as Jeff shares his story today, remember that what we all have to do, you did the first step by showing up. You did the second step by getting some food, because we have a lot of that, so thank you. And now you have to be ready for your third step, which is to enter into this experience with a Lev Shomea, with an open heart, with a listening heart, and to really be able to see how this might affect you, and also maybe how this might help you think about your friend Jeff, for those of you who are here because of your personal relationship with him, maybe in a different way, to be able to kind of deepen that relationship that you have with him. I'll also just say, before I turn the microphone over to him, that since we have a nice full room here, that if you enjoy being here in this space with us, then you should come back again. And so actually Wednesday evening is our Kukar Yom HaShoah program when we'll have the opportunity to hear from George Marcus and to hear his family's story connected to the Holocaust. Friday night this week, the 17th, we have a really special Friday night service where it will be filled with professional musicians sharing Mizrahi and Sephardi music at 6:45 p.m. All are welcome. A registration, an RSVP in advance would be invited. You can find that on our website. And then April 26th, which is a Sunday, in a couple of weeks, we're going to be at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We have a bus actually leaving from BTBJ to take us to the old city of Philadelphia to have a walking tour, a Black Jewish walking tour of Philadelphia. And so we'll be joining together with some local churches, and you're welcome to join us if you're curious about that as well. So lots of different ways to be able to engage with one another. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to our friend Jeff.
I'm going to put this microphone here, but if anybody knows me, I probably don't need it. But in any case, I was sort of volunteered for this by a party who will remain nameless right now. But this is a story of my father. It's an emotional story for me, as you can already hear. It's not, if you came here to learn about the Nuremberg trials or some of the other adventures that my father had, I call them adventures, you might call them something else, like a nightmare, but that's not what we're here for, or I'm here for anyway. It's one man's story. My father never presented it anywhere, and he said, I'm not really interested. There's a lot of people who had it a lot worse than me, which is true. But this is one man's story of what he went through. Now, I'll be walking around here. We'll start here. Here we go. I have pictures from the past. My father was a professional photographer, so photographs were really important to him. And this is a book of my family. So there's some pictures that go back as far as 1908 in here. It's just people pictures, really. So you're welcome to look through them if you see them. There's some other artifacts and stuff that I brought here that you're welcome to look through. By the way, I have to give a plug for the synagogue. If you want a hard copy of this, it's fine. You can take one. I would appreciate you give a donation to the synagogue. If you want an electronic copy, you can talk to Ivy, my wife, or some of the other gentlemen around here who understand how all this stuff works. So not that, believe it or not, I used to be in the computer industry, but you'd never believe it. Back before there were PCs on everybody's desk, so I may be a little older than I look. My father was born in 1921 in Berlin. His name was Rudolf Manfred Britzmann. So he ended up changing his name, as you'll hear, because it was a German name, and because of some of the things he went through, he had to change his name. He passed in 2008. My mother was also a German refugee from the Bavaria area, a town called Plauen. She passed in 2014, but I won't be speaking much about her adventure or her story. She never talked about it a whole lot, but we'll go through what my dad was willing to do. I'm going to take this, put it over here, and see if I can work this. It's real tough, it's one finger. So my father was born in East Berlin in an apartment in a blue-collar area. Actually, my wife and I eventually visited. It's called Gubenestrasse. It's what is now East Berlin, was East Berlin, I should say. His father was Dr. Bernhard Britzman, and he was a general practitioner, obstetrician, and a mohel. So, but they were just middle class stuff. Whoops. All right, well, doesn't matter. Let's go back. That was my father on the first day of school. In Germany, it was customary to get a cone full of candy. God, I would have liked that. But that was customary in those days, and he's about 6 years old. That is his father, my grandfather, who I never met. I never met any of my grandparents. I never had that opportunity. And my mother's parents were from a more rural area. He was a shochet, for those of you who don't know, that's a ritual slaughterer, and a rabbi. They both died right before the war, as far as I know. I didn't research that too much or didn't go into it too much, but most of old age. She was the third child, so she was the youngest. My father's father, well, let's go back a little bit. In 1931 in Berlin, you started to see swastika flags around. It's in 1931, so I'm going to try to do this in chronological order. It wasn't like we all, or most of us, have an emotional reaction to that swastika sign. In those days, obviously there wasn't that issue. My grandfather, his father wanted him to become a rabbi. He decided he'd rather be a doctor, and so he became a doctor. Both he and my father, as I understand it, especially my father, did a lot of swimming for exercise. For a hereditary back problem. In 1933, Hitler became chancellor. So you're a Jewish kid, little Jewish kid, gone to school. 1933, my father was born in 21, so what's he, 12 years old? And instead of saying, "Good morning, teacher," which they do every day, it was "Heil Hitler." And that's everybody, all the children had to say that in the classroom. So here we go. One day at school, if you ever met my father, he's about this tall, and he liked bad jokes. You know, he was the original dad joke guy, you know, and stuff like that. But he got in a fight at school after a kid called him a dirty Jew, and he said he beat the heck out of him. He beat the kid that said it. He called him a dirty Jew. He was the only Jewish member of a swim club, and eventually they told him, "You have to withdraw because you're Jewish," and he joined a Jewish swim club. And this is all about 1933, and the Jews had started leaving. My father tells a story. A lot of the book, the way he wrote it, was about the good parts of his life, not so much about the difficult times. There are some sections, but he would talk about how, as a child, he would play in the exam area. Now, you remember, my grandfather was an obstetrician, so you can imagine the tools that he was playing with. And he loved the medical books, to look at all the gross stuff in the medical books and stuff. So he talks about that. His grandmother, my great-grandmother, lived with them. Her name was, they called her Omi. He had an older brother named Heine, and he played the piano. Eventually, in 1935, the piano teacher said, "You can't teach Jewish children anymore." So you just couldn't do it. Here's where it gets a little rough. In 1936, now my father's about 15 years old. His father, the doctor, Bernhard, gets arrested and thrown in Moabite police prison, framed for illegal abortion. Turns out, why would he do that? There was no case there. So after 10 days, the lawyer contacted my grandmother and said he died of suicide with his own belt. Now, what kind of prison, especially an efficient German prison, would allow a prisoner to have a belt or shoelaces? So it was wrong. 2 to 3 days later, my grandmother, my father's mother, said, "Your husband's being released, no case," after he committed suicide in prison. So that was a big impact. My father's 15 at the time. So at that point, my grandmother, from what I've read, was a very gregarious, fun-loving person, and that all changed. Her husband was gone. It was rough for a Jew to be in Germany. They moved to a smaller apartment. My dad tried to get a job, and he not finished high school. He never got the opportunity. Tried to get a job in a microscope, then a factory, and then he worked in 1936 in a pharmacy. The problem is Jews aren't allowed to sell drugs in 1936 in Germany. The public pool had signs, Jews not welcome, don't come back. He was told, don't come back there. So the Jews weren't even allowed to go to the public pool, so he couldn't even train for swimming. And he was a pretty good swimmer, from what I understand. He won a couple medals in racing and stuff, and he really enjoyed that. When they had the Olympic Games around 1936, there were all the signs around Germany saying forbidding Jews, Jews not allowed, similar to what happened in Reconstruction here to African American people. Jews not allowed, no Jews. They removed all the signs for the Olympics, but the policy was still there. In 1938, Jewish businesses began to be publicly identified. So they would write Jude on the windows. And my father would go back with turpentine on the pharmacy, and he would clean it all up. And by the time they came back a couple hours later, it was up again. And then 1938, November of 38, it was Kristallnacht. So Jewish businesses were looted. Non-Jewish people would just go take whatever they wanted. They burned the synagogues. It was really scary and awful, and the Jews were trying to get out. And I'm going to grab this. In arts, and life was getting impossible. My father got into art school. He was an artist. It's just one of his. As you can see, he wasn't too bad. This was a sketch that he did, and I'll explain what it is in a little bit. But it's part of his adventure. So my dad was always an artist. He knows oil paint, watercolor, sketches, whatever he could do. So he just enjoyed that. Unfortunately, I didn't get any of that, but my sister got it. So I got my mother's math ability, or at least I used to have it. So life was getting impossible. So it's easier for me to give you an idea, and this is what I'm trying to do, give you an idea of what life was like just before war in Germany. Life for Jews in Berlin was not getting possible. Not only were the signs in big letters, not for Jews, up all over, but Jews found it difficult to make a living. I'm sorry. Okay. Every Jew wanted to immigrate, but where to? Most countries would not admit them. The United States had strict quotas and required an affidavit from someone in the U.S. guaranteeing support, so you would not become a burden to the state. Sound familiar? The wait lists, and every day different rumors went around the Jewish community about certain countries issuing visas for immigration. Long lines formed outside, say, the Venezuelan consulate or the Dutch consulate, only dispersed after an hour or so with the advice, go home, there's no truth to the story. So people couldn't get out. They're running around like rats in a maze trying to find a way out. And this is exactly what my father says. One day you'd go to maybe Cuba in your imagination, or Tanganyika, or Canada, or Bolivia, anywhere. Shanghai, and I had an uncle apparently who ended up in Shanghai and then came to the United States. Shanghai would admit several thousand refugees, it was said, but you had to be able to pay for it. So it was all about being able to pay for the passage. My grandmother just didn't want to go to China. So she wanted to go to England. His brother, Heine, ended up, with help of his swim team, getting to Chile. So I have a whole branch of the family that I've only met once, maybe twice. I have a first cousin I've met a few times, but the others, her children and her husband's children from earlier, I hardly know them, met them once. We traveled once down there. So we have a whole branch of the family in Santiago, Chile. So this is the diaspora. So they started arresting Jews, and people would just vanish. No idea what happened to it, or they emigrated, or they vanished into concentration camps. So the idea was to get the kids out first. That's what all the parents decided. So U.S. had quotas. Through connections, my father, a good, very close friend of his mother's, knew somebody they met on a trip. And they were able to get my father. He had to put in some money, and they didn't have enough money. But that friend of my grandmother's befriended this woman named Louisa Howie. And instead of paying him, because they didn't have the money, she offered free shelter. And the woman was an angel. So with my uncle going to Chile and my father going to England and staying in London with Louisa Howie, grandmother was left there alone. Her husband was dead. She was living in a small apartment. And on July 12th, 1936 or 38, I think it was the last time my father saw his mother. And 1938, so he was 17, 18 years, he's 18 years old. Never saw his mother again. And in September 3rd of that year, Hitler marched into Poland. So that was the beginning of the war. So this woman, Louisa Howie, who my father, let's see what pictures we got. I forgot about the pictures. I only have a few. You can't see that too well. I have the originals over here, but can you make it a little bigger? Okay. That's the Britzman family. So they were a typical Britzman. It's my grandfather in the middle, my grandmother in back, my father's brother on the left, and Slider.
I know.
So there they are at the beach. It's like the German equivalent to Atlantic City, I guess. So I just wanted to show you that they were just a normal family, and all of a sudden, everything turns to, better not, well, we're in public. So there's a picture of Louisa Howie in the book, but it became like a surrogate mother to my father. So here he's living in London. The mother's trying to get out. What's interesting is apparently my grandmother was trying to get out, trying to figure out, well, she didn't know where she wanted to go. She was writing letters. And my father, as you'll hear, had not been in touch with her, couldn't communicate. And at the end, which I'm not going to read from, is a letter that really upset my father when he read it years later. After his brother's death, his sister-in-law sent him all these letters that my grandmother had written to the older brother, Heine, saying, you got to get me out of here, you got to get me out of here. Things are terrible. And then eventually she had to give up her apartment. She had nowhere to go because she was Jewish, and eventually she disappeared into the Holocaust. So my father had no idea because he was incommunicado. What happened was, in London, the British required alien registration. Sound familiar too? So you have to register as an enemy alien, a friendly not refugee, or an alien refugee. And at that 1940, they British interned, like we did with the Japanese. The British interned about 20,000 people under very primitive conditions on the Isle of Man, which is what that sketches of. But my father, he's 18. This is an adventure. This is something different. This is, I don't know, exciting, but it wasn't so bad when you're that young. You go our age, I don't think there's anybody here under 21. So you go our age, it's a little different. So he was 18 years old, he was on the Isle of Man, and they were concerned on the Isle of Man about a German invasion at that time. Belgium, Holland, France, all been invaded. And now they were waiting on the beaches of Dunkirk. Maybe the Germans would show up. On the Isle of Man, they heard that people were being herded onto boats. And a lot of these boats were torpedoed on the high seas by the Germans. The U-boat thing going on, and a lot of people died. So it was, what they were worried about, the refugees, while they were saying an intern in the camps, was that here you have all the Jews together in a camp. What could the Germans want more? If they invaded and took over, they're gone. So, all the Jews were together. So on July of 1938, my father ended up having to board a ship. And this is the Dunera. There's books about it called the Dunera Scandal. I'll go into it just a little bit. There's considerably more in my father's story. But there's a movie been about it too, so we'll talk about that in a minute. But there were several hundred German Jewish refugees, and they were told they would reunite with their families later. And that was certainly not the case, never the intention. But the British are the ones who made them get on this boat, and this boat turned out to be something like a floating concentration camp. And it's called the Dunera. Now my father, being my father, asked Louisa Howie to send him his Boy Scout uniform, because he became it's for over 18 in Europe, and they have these equivalent to the Boy Scouts. And he wanted to show that he was British and all that. When they got onto this boat, all their luggage was taken away. The guys who were running the boat were basically kind of shady. They were soldiers, but they were like the dregs of the army, and they stole all their stuff. So now he had nothing. He was back on the boat, nothing. Now again, he's 18. He saw his suitcase, there's a story in there, and he sort of hooked it with a guy's cane and got his toothbrush out of there. And because they had no toothbrushes, they had no soap. And they were on a boat. There were 2,542 refugees on a boat with a capacity for 1,600 people. They were told they were going to the US or Canada, but it was like a floating concentration camp. They had no personal possessions. The first night, my father writes, he slept on the mess table because there was no place to sleep. But then one gentleman couldn't sleep in the hammock, so he got a hammock, and he was very excited about that. Bath facilities were latrines. Basically, a lot of it was just buckets. And you know what happens when the seas get rough and you got a bucket full. So that's sort of how they had to live. They had serious health issues, a lot of diarrhea, a lot of stomach issues. There were no lifeboats, no safety equipment, nothing. They only had salt water for showers and washing. One night they were sleeping and they heard a huge bang on the boat. Apparently it seemed to be a torpedo, but it never exploded. So when you talk about luck, all the way through, his mother meeting a friend who met somebody who was willing to take him and let him out, and then they get on a boat, and the boat gets hit by a torpedo, and the torpedo doesn't explode. They heard a lot of loud detonations off in the area with other boats getting sunk, but the torpedoes that hit it didn't explode. But this is now in July of 1940, and there was no fresh water on July 25th. None. And suddenly the weather started to get really warm, and they realized that they probably weren't going north. They ended up going to Africa and going around the Horn of Africa. They crossed the equator on July 30th, and finally on August 1st, they got fresh water again. What was interesting, though, is wherever you go, and there were Jews in camps and Jews on the boat, language lessons, talks about architecture and art and all the knowledge, because there were professors, they were doctors, there were a lot of really intelligent people, and they were willing to share their knowledge no matter how difficult the situation they were in. On August 8th, he was Cape Town. On August 10th, Indian Ocean. On August 16th, he had 3 months of internment, including about 8 weeks on this boat, or 6 weeks. There was occasional suicides. There were fevers. They had a separate deck where they kept Italian prisoners of war, and they were treated better than the Jews were treated, because the Jews were considered enemy aliens. So they're the enemy. And again, the kind of people that were shipboard from the army, they hit them with rifle butts. If somebody gets a little bit out of line, they would string them up. They would do all kinds of things because they were enemy aliens. Who cares? The Jews. Nobody cared. In September 3rd, he was in Melbourne. In September 6th, he finally got off and got on a train to what's called Hay Camp. Hay Camp is basically in the desert, on the edge of the desert in Australia. There is nothing there. To the day he died, since I knew him, and probably long before that, probably since the war, my father would never eat mutton, because that's all they had, day after day after day after day. And they'd use, well, there's a story, and I don't know if it's further in my notes or not, but they took the fat from the mutton and made soap out of it. Hay, mutton, yeah, lamb. So on November 4th, he got a letter from the niece of Louisa, who, remember, who took him in. She had been killed in an air raid attack, doodlebugs. And it's interesting because my father mentions in his book that the people say they'd hear an attack come, they go hide, and they hear the bombs explode and said, oh good, somebody else got killed today, not us. You know, it's just the attitude that you have to have. So, let's see on page, I've made some notes here so I can go back to the book. It says here, eventually, you know, Hitler said about the Dunera, not Hitler, I'm sorry, Churchill, said about the Dunera that that was a huge mistake, and that should never have happened. He apologized. But it says the attorneys were always at pains to explain their position in official terms. This is from the Dunera affair. One of the most important explanations offered took the form of a memo to the High Commissioner called the Dunera Statement, and it carried with the hopes of the attorneys once they arrived in Australia. But the treatment dealt out. The attorneys were addressed with the vilest curses only. For days, the officers refused to listen. The attorneys represented about the many threats and bodily punishments. These were just regular people. You know, they weren't enemies, they didn't carry arms, they didn't fight. Any attempt to seek recourse was frustrated. Slightest reason was good enough to provoke punishment. This is in the internee camp in Hay, Australia. So my father keeps interesting about the Germans arriving, and they kept them apart, the German prisoners. So there's sandstorms, things of that nature going on. But the fact that his Auntie Louisa was killed by a bomb really kind of took him aback, and it was really tough. So, he spent 18 months behind barbed wire in Hay, Australia, in an alien internment camp in the middle of nowhere. No communication. My grandmother had no idea what had happened to him. She knew she was writing to his brother in South America, trying to get out, and it just wasn't able to. However, he was young. Let's see if we got a picture here. That was my father in Australia, 1941. So, you know, he was a young guy, good-looking dude. So, you know. So they offered him an opportunity to join the British Army. And he was like, hell yeah, anything to get out of here. So they took him back to England, and he joined what was called the Pioneer Corps. It was made up of refugees, ex-cons, and as my father called it, general riffraff. If you know my father, well, even if you don't, it's a pretty funny picture. This picture always blows my mind, him sitting there in full, you know, battle fatigues, and that was just not my dad. He was the most gentle, fun-loving guy, and I don't know how he did it. All right. So the Pioneer Corps, he was built in Glasgow. Glasgow, Scotland, by the way, for those of you who don't know. And that's actually where my sister was born, I think. But that's later in the story. So he said, the first weekend in Glasgow, I and some friends went to the Jewish Institute, who would entertain the boys in the forces, one afternoon a week with tea and cakes and dance. And he said, I'm going to dance with her, pointing to a nice-looking Jewish girl wearing a crossover sweater. Her name turned out to be Laura Koenigssurfer, or my mom. I thought she looked rather sweet and intelligent and somewhat European. As for myself, I was considered to be one of the soldiers who had just returned from Australia. A little later, things were clarified. I made a date to go with Laura to the cinema, and she insisted on paying for the man who was fighting the war saying that I could pay the next time. My dad says, who knew if there would be a next time? Who knew if there was going to be? After some weeks, they got to know each other pretty well, I guess, because they ended up getting married. In 1943, May 43, he asked her to marry him, and they decided to get married on my mom's birthday, September 22nd. My dad was 22 years old. So from the time he left Germany to all what's going on is 4 years so far. They had a honeymoon in London, and they had the beetle bugs, and that's where his quote come in. It must have hit someone else. That was their attitude with these bombs dropping. And then he got transferred to Oxford. Now at that point, he ended up they recommended him to change his name. Rudolph Manfred Britzman. Sounds very British, doesn't it? So he changed it to Roger Bryan. Now when Ivy and I got married, I said to him, would you want us to change the name back to Britzman? He goes, absolutely not. That was German. He didn't want anything to do with Germany. Nothing. So he was on D-Day, right around D-Day, which is June 6, 1946, he was transferred to the enemy prisoners of war section because he could translate. What you got? You're confusing me. You're confusing me. He ended up going to Belgium, and that's my mother and father. A little while ago. This is from, you'll recognize, most of you probably recognize this, and that was from Belgium. So my father picked that up. We also have some Jewish money here. So, because they had that Jew. So, first he was put in construction, and then he was a clerk. In 43, he asked her to marry her. They had a London honeymoon and changed his name. Then he got transferred to the enemy prisoners of war section because he could understand what they're saying. So he tells stories of, he was at Nuremberg concentration camp, which is where they ended up, it was a concentration camp that they ended up using for enemy prisoners of war. And he tells me stories, he remember telling me about the SS guys. They think a guy would cooperate and they'd slice his throat in the middle of the night. You know, where they got there's stuff here like, I mean, he took this off a German prisoner, but. So this is what, Dave, you told me, you knew what this was.
That's a grabbing knife character who's in the German military.
So this is. That's how they treat each other. And the Nazis, the SS guys were the guys who were in charge. So that's my father at Nuremberg. So what's he, 22, 23 years old? You know, now he said he felt like a big shot because they had him address 4,500 prisoners of war. So he had to tell them, but what he did is he had a German prisoner translate for him because he didn't want them to know that he was German and that he spoke German. And he could understand what was going on, and they thought he couldn't. And there's a good story with that I'll tell you in a little bit. But in 1941, in November of 41, he found out that his mother was missing, and he had survivor guilt, as you might imagine. In Belgium in the 46, there was VJ Day. The war was over. Everybody's all excited, but most of the world and most of the population did not know about the atrocities that had occurred at that point. They just had no clue. He was a staff sergeant interpreter, and what was interesting, he tells stories that POW is yelling at him, Britzman, 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 and you know, and then he saw who it was. He then said, bring that guy to me, and he asked him, and the guy came over. He was his classmate that sat behind him in Berlin, and he goes, Britzman, it's you, it's you, it's you. And so he sort of smoothed that over because he didn't want him to know what's going on. But it was a pharmacy school student. So he said, you were in Berlin, right? He goes, no, never been to Berlin. So another story that he tells about some of this, I'll see if I can pick it up here. said we had a wild assortment of people in this camp. SS Einsatzkommandos, a few Wehrmacht soldiers, Nazi party officials, and other civilians, even some recently repatriated Auslanddeutsche, German nationals. During documentation, prisoner approached a corporal one day, "May I be permitted to ask the staff sergeant a question?" in German, of course. The corporal showed me the prisoner's file, and then I asked him to come closer. He says, "Have you ever been to Berlin?" And when I denied it, he mumbled under his breath, "Amazing resemblance." This fellow, whose name escapes me, went to pharmacy school with me when he was apprenticed, and actually was at my father's apartment at one point, because they were both interested in photography. So it's strange things happen. Former SS officers and higher party officials ruled inside the camp by assuming leadership positions and then intimidating and threatening other internees. My father, one of the guys, and he was a German soldier, but only because he had to be. And my father said he was a decent guy, and he said he had to get out of there real quick because it was known that he talked to us frequently. This guy Earhart. A friend of his inside the bunk warned him one evening not to sleep in his own bunk that night, saying that the SS were planning to get him. As unbelievable as it may sound, the following day a local policeman called on his wife in Hamburg to inform her that her husband had died in camp during the night. The plot was there, but it was foiled. We found later that an open telephone line existed in the camp hospital, and it was easy to have contact with the outside. So these guys had already there to tell the wife, although they foiled the plot, so the guy lived. So, which was interesting. Then in another time when he was in one evening I went frequently to the Sergeant's Club in Hamburg. Standing in front next to the driver, I heard a German woman saying, and I don't speak German, my parents never wanted me to learn, said, meaning, "I don't understand how our German girls can throw themselves at these Tommies like that." She was ready to get off, and without hesitation, I addressed her in my best Berlin accent. Now this is my father, for real. Remember, he was in British uniform. "Sie brauchen sich kein solchen zu machen, einen wird sich doch keiner vergreifen." If you know German, that wasn't German, but but it was close. It says, his answer was, he said to her, "Don't worry, nobody will make the mistake of touching you." And she was not able to utter another word. So I guess that's where I get my warped sense of humor, too. So, page 50, all right, so 40. In 46, he actually went back to Berlin. Ivy, did you bring the pin with you? He saw his mother's close friend, the one who had befriended Louisa Howie in England, and he was waiting to be what they call demobbed or demobilized, get out of the army. And but he picked up a couple pieces of jewelry. This piece was a ring from my grandmother, and I had made it to a pin. I'll leave it over there.
What's nice about it is the ring can come out. So the jeweler maintains the integrity of the ring instead of like ruining it. So you can take that ring out if you wanted to do it. You can wear it as a pendant, and I wear it
I think people can hear me. No, thanks. I'm sorry, I wander around when I talk. Can everybody hear me all right? Do you want me to put on a mic? I'll put on a mic. All right. No, that's just. All right. All right. Is that a little better? Oh, that's really loud. How do I turn it down a little bit?
I gotta do it on myself.
Okay. So, my father was waiting to be demobbed, as he called it, and he got a telegram from the British War Crimes executive, and I think in the book there's a copy of his orders, and he wanted to get out. I mean, he was done, and he got transferred to Nuremberg as a translator. He didn't really want to go, but, from what I've read in his book, there are books about Nuremberg. This is one. No, I haven't read it. Witness to Nuremberg. There's a new movie. Dave, you were telling me about there was a movie a long time ago, but there's a newer one now? Yeah. Okay. Just came out about Nuremberg, so if you're interested in that, you can go look at it. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about Nuremberg, but there were 33 indicted. Thank you. I'm sorry. This document up here, which you can see better in the book, is his orders, and that's his tribunal pass to be able to go get into Nuremberg. Now, you have to realize, I don't know how much you know about Nuremberg. I didn't know all that much, but this was the first time that anything like this had war crime trials had ever occurred. So they were making it up as they were going along. So there were 33 indicted defendants. My father was mostly just translating documents and terms and phrases. Do you have a picture? That's him at Nuremberg. So as you notice, he's going over some documents. The defendants all lied. It was clear. There's a story in the book about how the defendants, somebody could prove it, and he proved it that they all were just lying. They say they were just following orders, which was a bunch of garbage. So if you want to read more about what my father's feelings about, that's in the book, but he doesn't go into it too much. Although he did say he was a photographer also, so they sent him to the British Film and Documentation Unit, part of the RAF, and there he had to take pictures of some stuff that really was difficult. There were jars of human fat that were being used to be turned into soap. There were samples of skin that were made into lampshades and gloves. And the skin, he had known that Ilse Koch, you may have heard of her, she would select the tattoos on the prisoners' bodies to see which ones get made into lamps. So there were photographs of prisoners. They showed a photograph of prisoners that had just recently dug a large trench. They were all naked, and men, women, and children together, and their clothes were neatly piled by the side. And he saw a woman, and it could have been his mother. So he said he had a hard time sleeping for quite a while after that. But you don't know. But that's what happened. They just made them dig the trench and then just shot them all. The interpreter job itself, if you're actually doing the actual interpreting, was a grueling job. Yellow light means slow, red light equals stop. You're only allowed so many times to stop. He was there for the trial. There's a picture up right now, and that's... You're doing great. Of Nuremberg right now, and where's the... The first day in the courtroom, I was tense and somewhat nauseated. To see the whole rogues gallery not more than 20 feet in front of me was an overwhelming experience. Goering, with a derisive grin most of the time. Stryker, of Der Stürmer fame, whatever that is, I don't know and I don't care. Rudolf Hess, and all the other Nazi criminals. Hess was either a great actor or mentally disturbed. There was also, I forget which Nazi it was, but one of them was sentenced to death in absentia. Do you have the verdicts? Eichmann's not listed in this trial. My father, there's... Over here is, now these documents are 80 years old, but this is from the Nuremberg trials. This is the actual program. This is the actual indictment. These are originals. This is the verdict. I'm sorry. We're all so most of them, it looks like a large majority of them were death by hanging, and some were 20 years and 15 years. One or two were acquitted. They wanted him, he actually passed the translator's test. They said, oh, it would have been great money to stay for the next trial, which was the industrialists. But he had had enough, as you might imagine. So he passed the test, but he wanted to get home. The sentences were passed. What was interesting was Goering committed suicide. How do you do that when you're in jail? They said that there was an American officer that had sort of befriended him and slipped him a cyanide pill. So Goering got to, he was number 2. Let's see on page. Goering was death by hanging, Hess life imprisonment, Ribbentrop death by hanging, Keitel death by hangings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Eichmann is not listed here. One of the guys, I forget which, Martin Bormann was sentenced to death in absentia. So where he ended up, nobody knew. He was on a bridge, a bomb went off. He might have gotten to South America for what everybody knows. He went to Britain, and one day he was in England. I don't know if he was in uniform at the time. No, he was demobbed, so he wasn't. And he was looking in a window, and there was his cousin Honey, who they were close with in Berlin, looking in the window. In Glasgow, with my mother. My wife's right here. I'm looking at my wife. I'm looking at my wife. My mother, he formed a company called Bryan and Shear, which is a photography studio, but my wife's family, what was left of it, her brother and sister were here in the United States. So Dad went with the flow. He didn't like the weather in Glasgow. They were still building the business. Carol, my sister, was born there in 1947, and then they went to the United States. I don't know if anybody remembers on 60 Minutes a story about what they called the Ritchie Boys. Does anybody remember that? It's about Camp Ritchie, German refugees. That was my uncle. So my uncle was one of the Ritchie Boys. They were German refugees who helped out American intelligence during World War II at Camp Ritchie in Maryland. And my uncle was part of that. So, 1952, they were invited to visit the Jersey Shore by my uncle, who had started his own business here and did very well in industrial sewing threads, of all things, when we used to make clothing in the United States, which we really don't anymore. I'm not going to go into unless people have questions, his post-Nuremberg and the business he started, and then there's there's the letter from my grandmother and that kind of stuff in the back of this book. I have a few hard copies of this, if anybody's really interested. It's not like super exciting reading, but it does tell the story that I've just told. Do you want to throw? So, if anybody's interested in that, if you want one, then please make a nice donation to the synagogue. Other than that, we have it electronically. A friend of ours got these books printed. Her family owned a printing company, and we also have it electronically. So if you contact Ivy, hopefully she can send it out to you, if you don't mind, or I'll figure it out.
Just give my email.
Okay. So Ivy's email is ilbryan, spelled Bryan, at Yahoo. I don't know if anybody has anything. If not, I can give it to you later. So if you're interested in the story. So the hard part of all this for me is I'm an experienced public presenter, but as you can tell, it's a bit emotional. So, but if anybody has any questions, or ideas or anything they want to say.
We went to Germany like maybe 10 years ago, and we saw where his parents lived. We took the book with us and described the whole area. The floor was exactly the same as what was described in the book, and we wound up meeting a gentleman there who remembered the bakery that was down the street and knew some of the people. So it was so eerie to be back in a place where his grandparents lived and his father lived. And they also have the Stolpersteins. His cousin put them, and I don't know if you're familiar with them, they're the metal brass blocks that they started in Italy, and they put outside the houses of where Jews lived. And what
that were murdered in the Holocaust.
Yeah, people that were murdered in the Holocaust. And what they say is the day they were born and the day they were murdered. They didn't say the day they died. They said the day that they were murdered, which is very important. And so we polish them, and people come by and they ask you about them, and we told, what the story is and what the meaning. So it just shows that their life's, a family lived there and their life continues. And the other thing I just want to say is we have what's going on in this country now. I just want to say that the Nazis learned from our Jim Crow laws that we had back then. So when people say, oh, we're just like the Nazis, we're actually just like our country that way back when there was Jim Crow, that's what they followed and that's what they learned. So this history is extremely important that we don't forget.
My parents actually were invited by the German government as part of, I think, reparations and stuff, and they actually took them a while. They turned them down a few times, but they actually went back, and they visited the graves, such as they were of their parents, but they said the whole time they couldn't help thinking, where were you during the war? What did you do? How did you help? Because everything was fine in Germany. You saw a nice family, and then things turned lousy, and the non-Jews were like, well, as long as I'm okay, I'm fine, So, you were actually, part of this. So my parents always wondered, no matter where they went, they see an older woman sitting in the cafe that was around their age, and they're like, what did you do during the war? What would you, are you responsible? So.
I just wanted to say, I think I'm really loud. I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your story. And it's not about how you present it. I think what's really important and pertinent is that everyone shares their story regardless. And if people like yourself don't share this and continue to, then it's lost. And I guess it's that second generation, the generations and our children. And I think that's just like, what a wonderful thing by sharing unfortunate things. But
Our children have a hard time relating to it because, they're a couple generations removed.
however, I think we just still have to keep telling the story, kind of like Passover, right? It just has to keep being told. But you're right; it doesn't have the same effect as it does on you because it was your parents, your father in particular. But
It was my mother too, but
yeah, she didn't tell you.
She doesn't.
Right,
She
but I just
wasn't-
think it's so important to keep for children of parents and then grandchildren and continuing.
Thanks.
So thank you.
Jeff, I just have a quick question. I had been to Berlin, and so I have, my own mixed opinions about stuff about being in Germany.
Sure.
I'm curious to know what your parents felt about Germany and offering the repatriations.
My parents, as I explained earlier, never wanted me to learn German. They never wanted me to ever get a Volkswagen because you would hear the swastikas rattling around in the back. That's what, literally, they wanted to buy nothing German, have nothing to do with German. Well, your parents were killed there. What do you think? So they wanted nothing to do with it. My feelings are is there's a different Germany now. Yeah, there's some right-wing issues, but we went there, and I thought the people were nice people. It's just, it comes with a lot of baggage. You see the big arch, and you see all that stuff that you see with the German soldiers, and it just brings that back. And it was not.
There's certain things, like I would never go to Austria, but I would go to Germany. I did go to Germany, and probably would go back to Berlin. The fact that Germany has done a lot, supposed, in trying to repatriate as much as they can versus other countries who have done nothing.
Yeah, there's more to this story. I edited quite a bit, so I'm not going to take up any more time.
Jeff? Oh,
The-
sorry. So I thank you for doing this, whether you're volunteered or voluntold. It's all good.
There you go.
How did your father share the story? Was this something just organic that he just went and told you, or did you actually have to?
No, he
ask
went,
him?
in the 1990s, I taught him to use Microsoft Word. I was in the computer industry a long time ago, long time ago. But I taught him how to use Microsoft Word, and he decided he was going to write the story, and he wrote it for us, his children.
But did it but until then, had it ever come up?
Well, it comes up occasionally here and there, stories. In fact, there's pieces missing that I don't know. And I just have to be okay with that. Yeah, they had an interview through Gratz College, a verbal thing where they recorded, but the book is much more detailed. And they did ask him some questions and stuff, but as a child growing up, didn't come up much other than don't buy German.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Peter asked the question I was going to ask, but I also had a comment that I have friends who recently moved back to the United States after living in Germany for a couple of years, and we were having a conversation recently about it because a lot of our friends were traveling to see them there, and I don't have a relationship with Germany. I don't know much about it, but in a conversation recently, the friends who just moved back told us that they have mandatory Holocaust education, which is a lot more than we have here in the United States.
Yep.
I wanted to say that, back in the 90s, I visited a friend in Germany, of all places, Nuremberg. When she wanted me, we used to work together for shared medical systems, and she was stationed there for a while, and I didn't want to go at first. It was kind of an eerie thing, but she pleaded and pleaded. She's not Jewish. So I finally went. It was a strange feeling, but one of the things that I noticed back then in the 90s was that while she was working, I was traipsing around Nuremberg, and I went to the museum, and there was absolutely no information or history of anything that had occurred anywhere that I could see, except for some Jewish stars on the buildings in Germany. So I was really surprised that there was nothing back then.
Did you go to the museum with all the pillars?
I don't remember.
There was a German museum in Berlin, and that's
This
the
was
Ju-
in Nuremberg.
It's called the,
I
in
went to
Berlin there's a big Jewish
I
museum.
went to Nuremberg.
Yeah, okay.
The only thing I remember in Nuremberg was the most enormous Gothic church I've ever seen in my life. And it was so black and so Gothic looking, it was scary.
Yeah, there's a Jewish museum in Berlin, which is quite impressive, and it really gives you the feeling. Also, Yad Vashem is also pretty intense. So, well, I want to thank everyone. I'm glad that people showed up. I hope this was good. There's a couple things in here. You're welcome to come look. It's my father's sketch. This was made by German prisoners of war. He has no idea how, because they didn't have tools. And there's also my mother's jewelry box that was also made by German prisoners of war. So you're welcome to look through.